We are glad we have Dr. Subhrata Chattopadhyay today. He is a medical doctor and he is a professor in charge. What's that? Professor of Medical Physiology in the West Bengal Health University and visiting professor of this university. And he'll speak on a relation between mind and consciousness. He has written books also in Bengali and Mon O Chetana. As you know, consciousness is apart from the mind according to Indian thought, and we distinguish between mind, life, and consciousness. So, Dr. Chattopadhyay will speak on this very important topic, both from the ancient Indian perspective and from the scientific perspective. Dr. Chattopadhyay.
At the very outset, let me express my sincere thanks and gratitude to Honorable Chancellor, Pro-Chancellor, and other dignitaries for giving me the opportunity to speak on this topic on Doctor's Day. The title of my presentation is Relation Between Mind and Consciousness. And I tender an apology at the beginning that it will be broad overview across disciplinary boundaries. Only very few selected themes will be covered for time constraint, and some materials have been collected from the Bengali book Chetona Bigyan Dharma o Darshaner Aloke. So here is the agenda for this evening's presentation. What is mind? What is consciousness? What is their relation? How to address this question of relationship? And where should we go from here? Mind is millennia old question. What is the nature of the mind? How mind operates? Where is its location? It is most intimate possession that we have, yet mysterious, because nor we can touch, nor we can hold, not we can see mind, but we all hope to agree that we have minds of our own. And it is most difficult to define scientifically because in external world, its existence is manifestation is there, but not per se. Here we have to keep in mind that concept of mind as we find in philosophy, Western philosophy, psychology, the concept of mind in Indian philosophical tradition is somewhat different. In this discussion, we will mostly concentrate on mind as it is known in neuroscience, Western philosophy, and psychology in these traditions. So if we take the dictionary definition, what is mind? The Cambridge Dictionary says the part of a person that makes it possible for him or her to think, feel emotions, and understand things. Interestingly, in Oxford Learners' Dictionaries, they have added the word countable and uncountable. That means you may count or may not be able to count. That part of a person that makes them able to be aware of things, to think and to feel. Now, if you take any standard undergraduate psychology textbook, you will find that the psychologists, there have been serious discussions and the debates on the nature of mind. And the psychologists say that it is not their job, it is the job of the philosophers to prove that mind exists. They will simply work on mind, assuming that mind is already there. What is consciousness then? Consciousness, which in our language we say Chetana, in Sanskrit Chit, it's again like mind, millennia-old mystery, and intricately related with mind-body relationship. In a way, it is the most intimate experience that we have, but yet most unknown. And the enigma is that it is most difficult to reconcile with other areas of knowledge, physics, neuroscience, etc. And since 90s, it has been common area of inquiry for neuroscientists, psychologists, physicists, philosophers, theologians, almost all branches of the knowledge which are interested in this question. What is consciousness? Now, we will talk about the notion of culture later on. In our day-to-day world of language, consciousness, chetana, means when the subject is aware of the external and internal surroundings, when the subject is able to respond, he or she thinks, and cognition, affect, and emotional expression, and ultimately the question of self-consciousness or the notion of I consciousness. And in a way, this is one of the fundamental questions that we have. There are three fundamental questions generally scholars admit and address. How could something, the universe, come out of nothing? How could life, organic molecules, arise out of inorganic dead matter? And how could consciousness emerge in organic matter such as body and brain? Our topic of discussion falls into the third question. And the relationship between mind and consciousness is such that it has been historically studied by the philosophers and the theologians. Later on by the psychologists, and only in last few decades, the neuroscientists have joined the field to seriously inquire about the nature of the consciousness, or particularly the neural correlates of the consciousness, which we will talk just in a while. Mind and almost all scholars of all disciplines agree that mind and consciousness are invariably related. Now the question is, what is the nature of this relation? Is it the same thing, or is it mind the agency and consciousness its function? We will touch upon these questions briefly just in a while. Now in neurology, the subject which deals with nerves, neurons, nervous system, there have been cases of brain lesion and the consequent implications in cognition, behavior, changes in the personality. And there are three historical figures: Phineas Cage, Monsieur Leborn, and which are known as the classical case where there is lesion in the brain structure and consequent changes in the cognition, behavior. And so neuroscientists, the neurologists, they have known that brain is intricately related with consciousness, and the changes in the brain functions relate to changes in the states of consciousness. And with this knowledge, they have worked on that, but not directly touched upon the question of the consciousness per se. So in a way, mind is a black box, and we have seen the manifestations of mental functions or brain functions, but not directly the scientists discussed about consciousness till early 90s. Now, this has been the crux matter of our scientific inquiries in last few decades, and we will talk about the debates surrounding the relationship of the brain and the mind and the consciousness. And it is very interesting that if we think that, is it not amazing that some matter of about 1.3 kg starts thinking and also thinking about thinking? And the poets and the singers have in their compositions have talked about this enigma. For example, in a song you will find Amar Monke Niye Amar Joto Bhabna. Now, if you find these wordings, Amar Mon, that means the person and the mind are different things. Niye Amar Joto Bhabna, that means the person is thinking about his or her mind and then thinking of the mind. Who does this job? Ultimately, it is related with the intractable problem, mind-body problem, which has been there since millennia, and more so now in vitro culture of the human brain. We have human brain produced in vitro, and think about the situation that this dead matter, which is composed of the inorganic carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, in a particular fashion, it develops, and then develops the faculty of thinking, reasoning, then responding to the environment, etc. This is the question which has been addressed by the neuroscientists and the philosophers as well in last few decades. What is the relationship between brain and mind? Now here we have two major views of the mind-body problem. One is dualism, that mind and brain, body, are separate entities, but they interact with each other. And on the other hand, there is monism, which says mind is a property of the physical nervous system. That means the body. We will talk upon these two very different concepts, and there are distinguished scientists who champion these two very different notions of the relationship. Let's take the example of the dualism. In the year 1997, 77, distinguished philosopher Karl Popper and the Nobel laureate in physiology John Eccles published the book The Self and Its Brain, an argument for interactionism. Here in the book, there is the notion that the self interacts with the brain. That means self, here it is conceptualized as mind. Mind and brain are two different things, and how they interact, this is the subject matter of the book, The Self and Its Brain, argument for interactionism. And Karl Popper and John Eccles, they believe that the self and the brain, mind and the brain, are two different entities. And dualism, in the year 94, John Eccles came out with another book, which is How the Self Controls Its Brain. In the earlier book, it was the two different entities. Now, in this book, he describes about how the self controls its brain, two different entities, and the mind here controlling the brain in the year 1994. Interestingly, 3 years before his death, at the age of 91, Sir John Eccles, Nobel laureate in physiology, came out with this publication. In the same year, something interesting happened, that Francis Crick, distinguished and legendary scientist for discovery of the Watson-Crick model of the DNA, published the book Astonishing Hypothesis, and the hypothesis he describes in the very first paragraph of the first chapter of the book. And what does it say? It says, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Simply, he and the title of the book, subtitle of the book says The Scientific Search for the Soul. Here it is very important to note that in Indian tradition, we have Deho, Mana, Atma, body, mind, and spirit. In psychology, And in experimental science, whenever they talk about the soul, virtually it is mind. And here the scientific search for the soul, basically it is the scientific search for mind. Soul, the book doesn't touch upon what is really meant or understood or conceptualized as soul in Indian tradition. So basically what does this astonishing hypothesis say? It says you are nothing but a pack of neurons. The commentators say that actually it is not astonishing hypothesis. It may be described as a very depressing hypothesis that human beings are nothing but a pack of neurons and you don't have free will. So basically what it says that you are attending this webinar on the relation of mind and consciousness is governed by behavior of a large number of neurons which dictated you to be here and not watching the serials in the TV. So you don't have any free will. You are just a slave of the neurons, nothing but a pack of neurons. So here we are. The enigma is such that mind-body relationship, we have Sir John Nichols championing the cause of dualism, and on the other hand, there is monism, and these two camps are led by none other than two Nobel laureates in physiology or medicine. But at this time of era, most scholars or researchers who work on consciousness fall to the camp or belong to the camp of monism, that mind and brain are intricately related. They do not accept the idea that they are different. But we have problems with that. We will touch upon just in a while. So it's not just the nature of the relationship, even interpretation of the brain functions. There is debate. For example, the reductionist school led by Paul Broca, who discovered the Broca's area involved in neurophysiology of speech, says that the brain is organized in functionally distinct cortical areas, each specialized to perform a given type of function. That means you can, if there is a particular lesion in any particular area of the brain, you can say that particular function is lost, and consequent cognitive behavioral implications will be there. On the other hand, there is holistic school led by Pierre Mary, which says no specific part is assigned for any particular brain function. That means even if there is specialization, other areas, when there is demand, they can take over the function. Which one is true? There is element of truth in both these schools, and the issue is not settled. Now, approaches to study consciousness. Earlier we discussed that it was the area that psychologists, philosophers, and theologians discussed about the mind, body relationship, consciousness. In this era, there are different approaches to study consciousness. In the front line, it is neuroscience, because people have realized, and scientists agree, that if we have to decipher the mystery of consciousness, we have to work on the brain. So neuroscience. And I have quoted three Nobel laureates, Francis Crick, John Nichols, and Gerald Edelman. All, interestingly, all have these three Nobel laureates changed their fields and joined the field of neuroscience, because they find that it is the almost the last frontier of science. The quantum mechanics, Sir Roger Penrose, and he thinks that unless and until physics can explain the nature and the mystery of consciousness, physics will be incomplete. and he thinks that the quantum mechanics can help us to understand the mystery of consciousness. And he has written extensively on this topic. And there are other fields as well. For example, machine intelligence, which came about about half a century or more. So the leading researcher being Marvin Minsky, and we will talk about their position just in a while. And philosophy, theology, David Chalmers. Of course, there are plenty or many researchers, the scholars. I have named few because they are widely known, read, studied, and kind of forerunners of these streams of research. So if we take the neuroscience and the consciousness, it's very interesting. If consciousness is a mystery, and if you start working on that, then the scientists, they say, you do not know on which you are working, so how will you work? So Francis Crick says that the philosophers are good in asking questions, but it is not important at this stage to define consciousness, rather working definition of consciousness. Let us start with the easy questions, and I will quote his the pioneer paper just in a while. So basically, it is to identify the neural correlates of consciousness. Interestingly, here we are not saying neural basis of consciousness, because if we say neural basis of consciousness, then we are excluding other substrates of consciousness which are not neural in nature. That's why, and we do not know whether it is correlation or the causation. So in general, the neuroscientists use the term neural correlates of consciousness, and initially working on common sense experience like vision. And philosophers question the scientists that if we work on brain and neuroscience, can we really go into the mystery of conscious experience or the subjective experience? We will talk upon this question just in a while, but to start with, it is important to know that we are only at this stage working on easy questions like what happens in the brain when we see, what happens in the brain when we hear something like that, what happens in the brain when we engage in meditation or different types of meditation. I will talk about the meditation research towards the end of my presentation. So these are kind of the easy questions, not that the subjective experience like painfulness of pain, etc. So neuroscientists are at this stage asking the easy questions for which we can identify the neural correlates of consciousness. Here is the paper which Francis Crick and the Christoph Koch wrote in 1994 towards a neurobiological theory of consciousness. And the invitation is that it is the time for the science to crack the mystery of consciousness and work on the brain, and to start with the visual consciousness is the area they have talked in their science. Now here is the question that the philosophers pose to the scientist, that can objective information illuminate subjective experience? And here is the thought experiment. So philosophers come out with thought experiments to not to counter, rather to pose questions to have clarification about the laboratory experiments. So here is something very interesting, the concept of qualia. Qualia is qualitative feel of conscious experience. When you feel something like pain, pleasure, or any satisfactory experience, reward, whatever, you know what it means, how it feels. Now the question, to put this question, Andrew Jackson, an Australian philosopher, put the question in form of the Mary in black and white box. So here is the thought experiment. Mary is the famous neuroscientist who knows everything about color vision. So she knows the rods and the cones, the retina and the action potential. She knows how it travels, the electrical action potential, reaching the brain and how it is analyzed, and you see color. Now, the interesting part of the story, Mary has lived all her life in a black and white box. So she has never experienced or seen color. So one day she comes out of black and white box, looks at the blue sky and says with exclamatory expression, "Oh, is it blue?" Now the philosophers ask the question, if Mary have known each and everything about the color experience, has known each and everything, then she will not exclaim, "Is it blue?" That she expresses with exclamation, "Is it blue? Is it blue sky? Does it look like this?" means that she has not known the subjective feeling of seeing the color, that is blue. This is qualia, and the philosophers say at the core of consciousness is subjective experience. And without that subjective experience, you can, of course, relate the neural correlates, the nerves and the action potentials and the graphs and the images, everything. But how does it feel? That question is important. This came out, this question came out in very interesting and kind of landmark article, "What is it like to be a bat?" by philosopher Thomas Nagel, who wrote that actually it is the mind-body problem is so enigmatic, so intricately complex, and that it has not been solved in millennia, and it is almost impossible to judge, to decipher its mystery through experimental science. And he gives the example of a bat. Now the bats have very experience which are very different from that of human beings. For example, they're nocturnal animals. We do not have the capacity that we can fly in the dark and see the buildings or the objects in the dark through projection of the waves which are heated back and then analyzed in the brain. So bats have the capability of throwing waves and then analyzing the waves, and then they can traverse in the dark. We don't have that capacity. And they in the day hours, they hang like upside down, and it's very different from that human experience. Now Thomas Nagel says that you can analyze bat's brain, its nervous system, its working, its action potential, each and everything. You can even mimic a bat by hanging upside down. But with all these things, you cannot feel how it means or how it feels to be a bat. Then there was a series of articles that how it means to be a stone, how it means to be a for animal, how it means to be a, for example, anything you can imagine. Now there is important lesson and important very something very important from this paper, which ultimately questions the limits of objective information. For example, here every medical doctor will testify, this is today's Doctor's Day, that the male doctors are taught the subject of gynecology and obstetrics. Now, male doctors know each and everything about anatomy and physiology of pregnancy, conception, childbirth, etc. Do male doctors know what it means to be a mother? I doubt any male doctor will say yes to this question. So male doctors may know each and everything about anatomy, physiology of reproduction and childbirth and pregnancy, but he doesn't have the feeling about what it means to be a mother. So here again, another field, that machine intelligence, and they talked about they talked about this question of consciousness in an indirect way. Now remember that Sir John Nichols said that mind and brain are two different things. There was an interesting debate between Sir John Nichols and Marvin Minsky in the same platform on the area, and and they came out with their positions. Marvin Minsky says that there is no separate thing as mind, and they say that minds are simply what brains do. So whatever your brain does, it's mind. And Sir John Nichols, naturally, he disagrees with that part, and he also mentions his work, very interesting work, that a person is thinking, and just because of thinking, the person is thinking that he will move his hand, and the thinking, that particular thought is changing the circulation. And the Sir John Nichols explained these things on the basis of the quantum mechanics. He says that mind has the property of quantum mechanics in such a way that it can interact without violating the laws of physics. This has come up in computer science, particularly that when the computers exceedingly came out to match with the human intelligence. So can computer be conscious? Can machine be conscious? Alan Turing came out with the Turing test. Basically, what it says, that if a person, human person, is sitting in a room, and there are in two other rooms, there is one computer program and another in a human being, and he, without seeing them, the scientist seeing them, faces the questions and the answers. If he cannot distinguish between human being and the computer program, it will be saying that it has passed the Turing test, and the computer program has matched human intelligence. To this date, no computer program has matched or the ultimate test. And in a way, jokingly, it is said that Turing test is not to test intelligence, rather it is to test foolishness, how you can fool a person. That the Turing test is better known for. But there are serious repercussions of the computer and the consciousness. Particularly, initially computer, it was the job of the mainly computation. Later on, what about creativity? Now in creativity, it has found that the computer programs, although designed and created by the scientists, they can come up with some creative functions which the program didn't install in the very beginning. For example, the Aaron, the artificial intelligence painter created by Harold Cohen, started with very few paintings, and later on the abstract paintings are such that it is very difficult to say that whether it is done by a human painter, artist, or the AI painter. Now, this you may know because Sophia the robot even came to Calcutta and appeared in other cities as well in India. And the Sophia, the social humanoid robot, has been given citizenship by if I remember correctly, by Saudi Arabia. And it is, I mean, from the interaction, it is extremely difficult to say that it doesn't have the social functions of the human beings. But the question is, how does it feel? And the question is, how to know how does Sophia feel? That is the crux of the question. And but Swami Attopriyanandaji was there in NIAS, National Institute of Yes, in the Institute of Science, Bangalore, and I remember there was a discussion, and it came out with the question: if a computer can mimic all human functions, will we say that the computer be conscious? And even many scientists and even the persons of the art and literature say that there is no way to say that it is not, when if it can matches with the creative functions. So we are talking about the enigma, the puzzle, the difficulty, the why it is difficult when we talk about the subjective inner experience. And this is the probably the crux of the problem which we have between objective science and the subjective experience, which we can say and is known as explanatory gap. uh, think about any music you love, or in a Raga Bhairavi or the Western music, etc. Whenever you are impressed with a beautiful piece of music, uh, all you can do by tracking or recording air pressure waves. Now, question is, can you explain the melody of Raga Bhairavi or Behag on the basis of the air pressure waves? Even if you can, what is the meaning? Just with these graphs and your experience, what is the relation? This gap does exist, and the philosophers and the theologians say it will exist even with uh, our spectacular advances in the objective or experimental science. Now, we didn't talk about the culture, but this is very important. It has come out in recent years. For example, there are some words or the expressions or the experiences which are only there in language or in a specific culture and language, not in other language. For example, when I was in Western country, and there few of my friends said that Obhiman is a feeling, is a mental state no English word can describe. And Richard Nisbet came out with the book, The Geography of Thought, how Asians and the Westerners think differently and why. And this has opened up with the field cultural neuroscience, and it is showing, demonstrating that the way Asians and the Westerners perceive the world, respond to the world, and think differently. But at this stage, our relation between mind and the consciousness or experimental neuroscience do not talk about, have not touched upon the notion of the culture and the mind and the consciousness. But experimental evidence is there that there is definitely cultural influences on neural substrates of attentional control. So whenever we talk about brain functions, now there is a time to rectify our position as a teacher and student in medical physiology. When we open up the book and we see the chapter on brain, the standing assumption is that either it is Kolani or California or Baranagar or Birmingham, everybody's brain works in a similar fashion. That's not the case. That's not the case. The way brains, the culture influences the brain, and it has not come out, it has not been incorporated in our standard textbook. It's very new. It will take a couple of more years so that it comes in the textbook. This is important when we talk about consciousness, because in our language there are other concepts which come close but not similar to consciousness. For example, prana, the notion of prana, or chit, or example Chaitanya. We will talk briefly, but talk about Chaitanya towards the end. There is no English synonymous word which adequately describes this word prana or Chaitanya. So in a way, we are only in the very early initial stages of consciousness research so far as the science is concerned. Now, meditation is interesting in many ways, and historically, it is there. And what I find interesting is that there has been debate for years between the philosophers on the boundaries of, or the uh, Bhavbad and Bostubad, idealism and the materialism. And meditation research has put a question on the validity of this debate. Meditation, we all know, it is one of the 8 angas, Ashtanga yoga part. And earlier studies mostly used to address the functions of the heart and lungs. And it is well known that the meditation improves the functions of the heart and lungs. And in All India Institute, New Delhi, in 60s, they studied the nature of the brain waves in the yogis. And later on, the transcendental meditation, American Heart Association came out with a position description on its efficacy in hypertension. And it has been described as a voluntary, wakeful, hypometabolic state. It is just the practice or the mental state. And then we will see the interesting part of the debate. Meditation is state of mind, and it is bhav. Now here we find that the meditation research has come out with changes in the brain functions. It has been there. Also, it is changing the brain structures. That means here, just quick example of a report: alterations in brain structure and amplitude of low frequency after 8 weeks of mindfulness meditation training in meditation naive subjects. That means a person who didn't know anything about the meditation, after about 2 months, then there is particular change in the brain structure and amplitude of low frequency. Now, even not only the structure, even it is working at the level of gene expression and molecular signature of mind-body intervention, systemic review of gene expression, changes induced by meditation and related practice. Here is the question which I will pose to our to the audience, that all these years we have seen the debate between Bhavbad and the Bostubad, and that which came out first, which is the beginning, which is true, etc. And there has been fierce debate even in India about in the philosophical circles. Now, what does it say? Meditation research is saying that actually your state of mind affects your brain, and your state of brain affects your mind in a way that that materialism first and idealism second, or idealism first, materialism second, do not stand the test of the scientific research. And Bhavbad and Bostubad, materialism and idealism conflict, is probably too far-fetched, and it is because of our lack of knowledge for which we exaggerated the debate between Bhavbad and Bostubad. The reason is that with our limitation in the knowledge of consciousness, we have done many wrongs. And for example, here which as a doctor, as a neurophysiologist or the physiologist, I find it very I find it very painful in the sense. For example, when I was going through the literature of Sri Ramakrishna's Bhava Samadhi, and in his era, he was criticized, he was misunderstood, because nobody knew any idea about what Samadhi means and what does it, how does it translate to the science. So wrongly, even person like Shivnath Shastri said that it was epilepsy, temporal lobe epilepsy. The scientists, a few scientists have discovered that. It is wrong. First of all, yes, there are some very interesting observations and the experiences you find in patients of temporal lobe epilepsy, but not temporal lobe epilepsy patients show religious experience, and all religious experience cannot be ascribed to temporal lobe. So it is totally limitation and ignorance for which we for many years didn't pay much attention, didn't value, didn't appreciate, and being the unique experience, those persons were at the mercy of kind of the lower intellect people who would criticize them. Now, we do not have at present no idea about what does Chaitanya mean. Sri Ramakrishna on Kalpataru Divas said, Tomade Chaitanya Hok. Now, very interesting that when he was using Tomade Chaitanya Hok, everybody was conscious. If everybody was conscious at this stage, what that extra thing he was praying for those people to happen. That means Chaitanya and Chaitanya are two different things, and Chaitanya is not attained yet, and he in his divine discourse he has extensively talked about the nature of Chaitanya. And here we find that the Bhava Samadhi seems to be the last mystery, not only of science, but the knowledge, because it poses the question, how can you describe something which is indescribable? Sri Ramakrishna tried to describe the experiences, but at certain stage he says it is impossible. And it is bound to happen, because whenever there is distinction between subject and the object, then only that the object can be described. If there is no separate I, if there is no separate self, if Swami Attopriyanandaji, I remember in that Bengaluru conference gave the example, and it is there in the Kathamrita as well, that a doll made of salt, if it wants to measure the vastness of the ocean, the simple small doll just melts in the ocean. So if there is no separate I, then who will describe what is there to describe? And science at this stage is totally silent and not yet ready to talk about or touch upon this consciousness. So with this, it is kind of the humble appreciation of the vast wisdom of our sages, our rishis, our avatars, and our tradition, that consciousness which was there in the days of Upanishad now has entered the field of science. Now it is being studied by the scientists, the Nobel laureates, and the philosophers, and all scholars of all disciplines, and it is vibrant topic in modern days. So let us conclude this discussion with universal prayer, particularly on Doctor's Day. Sarve bhavantu sukhina, sarve santu niramaya, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet. May all beings be happy. May all be free from sickness. May all see and experience what is good and beautiful in life. May no one be unhappy. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Namaskar.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chattopadhyay, for your excellent presentation covering a very vast ground in just about 45 to 50 minutes. It may take several hours to discuss these topics, and he has made a very extensive research internally and externally on some of these topics. And he covered neuroscience And he said how consciousness research is now being performed by not only neuroscientists, but also by physicists like Roger Penrose, machine intelligence people, the computer people, the artificial intelligence people. And Roger Penrose, as you know, has written 3 valuable books. He began with the first book, The Emperor's New Mind, which is a parody of Emperor's New Clothes. All of us know the interesting story of a king who was very stupid and foolish, but he could be easily duped by his ministers. They told the king, "You look so handsome, so beautiful without clothes, and we will clothe you with some kind of a divine aura." So he was disrobed, and some mystical chants were made, and he was made to assume that he is clothed by a very divine kind of clothing. And he was parading out, and everybody said, "Oh, the king, you look so handsome, so beautiful." A small kid stood up and said, "Are Raja Ulango, Raja has no clothes on." The parody of this, the emperor's new clothes, is the emperor's new mind. He was arguing against artificial intelligence. The claim is that the brain being matter, it can completely and totally perform all the functions of human consciousness. The famous robot, Sophia, is an example. So he begins with a very interesting prologue, which Dr. Chattopadhyay just now mentioned. A super computer is being inaugurated in USA, which can perform several billion calculations in just a nanosecond. It's an omniscience. Any question can be answered. So the inventor with great pride said, technocrats are there, politicians and all intelligent people, scientists, philosophers. Now, ladies and gentlemen, a new super computer is going to be inaugurated. It's almost omniscience. Who will put the first question to inaugurate the computer? There's dead silence. Nobody wanted to open the mouth to show that he is stupid before an omniscience. A small kid got up and said, "Sir, can I put the first question?" "Oh, come on, kid." People thought, after he's a small boy, it doesn't really matter if he exhibits his ignorance. What does it feel to be a computer? The computer went on and on. Calculation after calculation, it took half hour, 1 hour. Finally, he said, "I do not know." The huge uproar, people burst out laughing. So he said, "You may do everything, but do you know that you are doing it?" So in a simple parlance, not philosophy or theology or religion, to do something and to be aware that you're doing something are 2 completely different things. Are you aware that you are aware? So awareness, consciousness, wakefulness, mindfulness are very commonly used these days in regard to meditation. And heartfulness. Now people are saying not mind, but the heartfulness. English is extremely inadequate to describe the happenings in consciousness. The main problem is the language, because the entire European language system is geared to express what is happening in science in the outside world, in nature outside, external nature. And the entire vocabulary of Sanskrit was developed to describe the inner world. And therefore, to put these ideas into English is the most confusing and most misleading. You say mind. Any average Indian mind, not highly developed intellectually or philosophically, will ask you, oh, you ask about the mind? Do you mean manas? Do you mean chitta? Or do you mean uh, ahankara? Or do you mean the buddhi? Which one do you mean? And the Buddhists and the Jain philosophers have analyzed the mind to such an extent. Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the varieties of the mind. So they have gone so deep into mind and distinguished between mind and consciousness. And the Upanishadic literature, which is a marvelous analysis of the 5-layered human personality. What is a human personality? We talk of the body and then the mind and the emotions and so on. They said there are 5 layers. They said Annamaya, Pranamaya, Manomaya, Vijnanamaya, and Anandamaya. And roughly speaking, the Annamaya is the Jada, inert, and the Pranamaya is what we call life. And in Indian wisdom, life and consciousness are not the same. Life is prana, and every animal, every plant has prana. What the Sir J.C. Bose's discovery is that everything is vibrating with the prana. Rabindranath's famous quote from the Vedas, Prano Virat. He wrote a beautiful lecture on the religion of man, in which he emphasized the idea of prana rather than Chaitanya or consciousness. Prana is something which is easily understood. The discovery of prana is one of the greatest discoveries of the rishis. Apart from the jada, in between the jada and the chetana, there is a prana as a link. A very simple question which has been troubling me since childhood. We were little children when we grow up. How do we grow up? The mom tells you, the elders say, eat well, eat nutritious food, take carbohydrate, take this, take protein. Now, all that you eat is a jada or chetana. Obviously, you'll say the rice and the dal and the vegetables and the bread that you eat, they are not conscious beings. So they are jada, unconscious entities. And by eating these unconscious entities, a mysterious process takes place within you by which cells are developed. And the cells are conscious beings. How does jada get converted into consciousness? You grow. This the ancient rishis discovered as the prana. Prana is a converting agency which converts jada and chetana. Ultimately, therefore, the distinction between the jada and chetana completely vanishes. So the annamaya, pranamaya, seat of emotions. Then the manomaya, which is what we normally call the mind in the Western parlance. Beyond that, there is a vijnanamaya, which also, unfortunately, for want of any language, we call it mind. Is called the buddhi, is called the dhi, is called the prajna, it is called medha. How many different words have been coined in Sanskrit language to describe the subtle nuances of all this? They've been researched into, they've been thoroughly discussed, documented, millennia upon millennia by hundreds of thousands of people who have experienced this. With such a rich tradition, trying to put all that into English and try to fit our ideas into the Western world and vindicate them and justify them through the eyes of the Western world is a huge misleading exercise that we are unfortunately embarking upon. In this light, Dr. Chattopadhyay, having exposure to either world, has come out with a new way of thought by which you don't have to justify anything this way or that way. These are two independent ways of functioning. We learn from one another. The Western world was not exposed. And how the idea of the Vijnanamaya as buddhi the Nischayatmika Buddhi, and how this Buddhi or Dhi develops, and beyond that is the Anandamaya, the idea of the spirit or the soul, Atman, distinct from the mind, the prana, manas, and the Annamaya, comes from the Vijnanamaya. This was discovered long ago, and that is the importance of the Gayatri Mantra. So we have a question there, which I'll remember read out.
So there is a question in Vedanta. There is the idea of universal mind, apart from the idea of infinite consciousness. Therefore, shouldn't it be said that dualism in the neuroscience perspective is more compatible with the Vedantic perspective than monism?
Would you respond to this? Then I can chip in.
I feel embarrassed to talk about Vedanta.
No, please,
of,
please, go ahead.
Brahmachari Tanda Swami, Attapriyanandaji. In a way, yes. In a way, yes, that body, mind, and spirit are not exactly the same. And in that way, it is not dualism, probably it is triplism. But in the other way, when we have Sarvang Khalu Vidang Brahma, Sarvang, everything, it goes to the idea of monism. So we may conceptualize these things as kind of the layer. For example, in this world of Nama and the Rupa, name and the phenomena, we see the differences, the varieties, etc. That's real. That's not to ignore. But it's not totally, absolutely true or the truth. And with progress in the state of mind, with mental practice, meditation, austerity, spiritual practice, and with the teachings of Sadhguru, people then come to realize and go towards the notion of Madatma Sarva Bhutatma. In there, it is the towards unification, towards the goal, towards the monism. And this is my humble understanding. I am also learning, a student in Vedanta or Indian philosophical systems with no formal training or background. So I will request Attapriyanandaji to illuminate us on this subject.
So the universal mind is a concept in Vedanta, which is called the Hiranyagarbha. Just like individual minds exist, the aggregate of all the minds is called the universal mind or the cosmic mind or the Hiranyagarbha. And the monism which Dr. Chattopadhyay is speaking about is not the Advaita at all. This word monism is used to explain the lack of separateness. Now, the questioner says, idea of a universal mind apart from infinite consciousness. See, once again, always, if you are really serious about Vedanta and the modern thought, keep the idea of the Panchakosha paradigm. I have myself personally felt it extremely useful and scientific. Annamaya, Pranamaya, Manomaya, Vijnanamaya, Anandamaya. And there is a cosmic counterpart to these. The individual self, which is realized in the Vijnanamaya, which is called the Dhi, which is called the individual self, the Jivatman, the Vyavaharika Atman, which transmigrates, goes Punarjanma. There's a cosmic counterpart to this, which is called the Samashti Vijnanamaya, which is the Hiranyagarbha. And beyond the Hiranyagarbha is the Anandamaya, which is identified with the Ishvara, the Saguna Brahman or consciousness. And even beyond that, Advaita Vedanta says, there is a Nirguna Brahman in which there is no name and form. And therefore, we loosely use the word consciousness. The questioner says the cosmic mind which is separate from consciousness. I do not know what he or she has chosen to become anonymous. That's also good, because when you go to Vedanta, Namarupa vanishes. The questioner vanished into Anama and Arupa, although he could have revealed his or her identity. So since there's an Namarupa, there's no Namarupa in the questioner, I take it that he thinks that consciousness which he uses there, he means the consciousness which is above the Vijnanamaya, or which is the Anandamaya, the Ishvara consciousness. So in Vedanta, it's clearly said, even at the level of Vijnanamaya, the consciousness is limited. And the cosmic mind is called Samashti Buddhyupahita Chaitanya, which is called the Hiranyagarbha in Vedanta, and Mahat in Sankhya. And beyond this is the Anandamaya, which is the Ishvara consciousness as Saguna Brahman with attributes and form and name. And beyond that is the Supreme Brahman, which is Nirguna, and so on. So these are the various conceptions in Vedanta. So please don't mix up these two. And don't say, is this not that? Should it not be that? So don't have a mechanistic view of philosophy or Vedanta and try to map one onto the other. These are different ways of thought, different ways of thinking. Just like you take a concept in biology and map it onto physics or to mathematics and say, is this not that? Please don't do that. You may have some rough idea for comparison, and loosely and vaguely throwing words like consciousness and universal mind, etc., without specifying the system from the point of which you are talking about is very risky. In fact, even in Indian thought, Sankhya has a particular way of thought, Vedanta has one, Yoga has a completely different way of thinking. Ishvara in Vedanta and Ishvara in Bhakti Shastras is not the same as Ishvara in Yoga. And therefore, we should be very careful in throwing words, particularly in English.
True.
So we heartily thank Dr. Chattopadhyay for making an excellent presentation. So tomorrow we have Dr. Arkadev Datta, who will discuss probable neural mechanism of concentration deficit. This is one question which all the people, young and old, keep asking. Why is it that we are not able to retain our concentration? Particularly during the pandemic, people are becoming restless, people are losing their tranquility. So is there a neural mechanism which can explain, analyze, and if possible, overcome this concentration deficit? Dr. Arkadev Datta, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sports Science and Yoga in our department. So we close today with thanking all of you, the audience, the questioner who was Anama and Arupa questioner, and particularly the speaker. Thank you so much.